What I'd like to do for this video is take a look at something other than fantasy fiction, which I have been doing in that little video series on the Wheel of Time, enhancing the reading experience. As a teacher, I want to be skilled at enhancing the reading experience for my students of the books, the poems, the stories, the novels, the short stories, and all things in between that we engage with in the classroom. You know, it's possible that not as many teenagers are reading as was once the case. I don't know the data on that point, but it's possible. So to enhance the reading experience would be a laudable goal for any English teacher that would like to find some success in their classroom. But what I have here is How English Works, a linguistic introduction by Ann Curzan and Michael Adams. I like this textbook. I used it in grad school. And I'm back in the glossary once again, and I have opened up to the S's and see a term called speech act theory. Okay, speech act theory. That by itself doesn't necessarily carry a lot of meaning for us. It's a theory going on, so it's something that's standing to be proved or supported with good evidence. It's waiting for something to be proved, I guess. It's speech act, and so we're thinking about speech. We're thinking about actions, acting, speaking. So let's see what the definition is. It says approach to language that conceives of language as performing actions. So that's the first part of the definition here, an approach to language that conceives of language as performing actions. So that's interesting. So what we need to do now is kind of turn our minds to think about language itself, and I guess we need to be open to the view that you can think of language in different ways. You can conceive of language in different ways, consider it as X, as Y, as Z, and this definition of speech act theory says it's an approach to language that conceives language as performing action. So we're looking at language as a thing which we use to perform actions. I was going to say that performs actions, but that kind of takes the doer out of the idea, the actual agent that is doing the performing. Me, for example, right now, using language to perform actions. And I guess this is an approach to thinking about language. We can think of language this way. It's just like an interpretation or a view. I guess an approach, works. You could say angle, maybe. And it goes on. It says any instance of language that does so is called a speech act. Okay, so any way we use language to perform some action, such as a prayer, if we use language to cast up a prayer to the heavens, then we are involving ourselves in a speech act. We are performing an action with speech. That seems to be pretty obvious. If I give a suggestion to my friend in regards to some personal trouble he's been experiencing, then I guess my suggesting these things to him is the action that I'm performing with my language, with my mind, with my words, right? So anything like that could be called a speech act. Seems pretty intuitive and down to earth. It says, see also constantive speech act, direct speech act, elocutionary act, indirect speech act, and it has others. So let's take a look at direct speech act and see if we can't append more meaning to this idea, right? So let's see. All right. Direct. So there's a definition for direct speech and direct speech act. I feel like we should look at direct speech first. It says an unmodified utterance. Okay. as opposed to indirect or reported speech. Okay, so we're opposing the meaning of this term against the meaning of indirect speech or reported speech. It says it's an unmodified utterance. Let's see, it says an example. Do you know what direct speech is? Is direct speech. Whereas Michael asked whether you know what direct speech is indirect speech. Okay, so I see a difference in those examples. I do. Do you know what direct speech is direct speech. So I'm directly asking someone about what direct speech actually is. This seems to be direct. I'm the one that's doing the asking right to the one that I'm inquiring of to gain clarity on the matters. But it says, Michael asked whether you know what direct speech is indirect speech. So I guess I'm not the one that's asking what direct speech is. I'm telling you that this guy over here has asked you what direct speech is. So that's more indirect. So I see the difference, even if I'm not, I have an intuition of the difference, even if I'm not able to perfectly describe what that difference is. But let's go down to direct speech act, since the first term we looked up was speech act theory, which we've learned is a way of viewing language as what we use to perform actions. And anytime we use language in this way to perform actions, then we are, I suppose, performing a speech act. So it says a direct speech act is a speech act in which a locutionary act corresponds exactly to an elocutionary act. Okay, that doesn't help us at all. I don't know what a locutionary act is and how it corresponds exactly to an elocutionary act, but apparently that would be what a direct speech act. So what do we do to, clear up these matters? We look up these words. So let's look up locutionary act. Right? So it says a locutionary act in speech act theory. Okay, so we're still within that context. The sounds and words that compose the supposedly reverential meaning of an utterance. The sounds and words that compose the supposedly referential meaning of an utterance. So the sounds and words that compose the supposedly reverential meaning, maybe literal meaning of an utterance. So if I say there's music playing in the background, the sounds and the words that I use to communicate this literal idea is the locutionary act. That is the locutionary. A locutionary act would be to take those words and to make literal sense out of them, referring to something directly in the world, I suppose. So I guess going back to direct speech act, it says a locutionary act corresponds exactly to an elocutionary act. Well, I guess we need to figure out what an elocutionary act is, or else we won't really understand the meaning of this term, or our meaning here. An elocutionary act, here we go. In speech act theory, they started this the same way they did the locutionary definition. Intended or conventional meaning that can accompany a locutionary act within the compass of an utterance. Intended or conventional meaning that can accompany a locutionary act within the compass of an utterance. So we have an utterance again. An utterance is like just an expression of our meaning in some form. And an elocutionary act is intended or conventional meaning that can accompany a locutionary act within the compass of an utterance. So to go back to my example, if I say there's music playing in the background, the locutionary force or the locutionary act is me using those words to express literal meaning, and then the elocutionary act is more so my intention. So the locutionary force of the utterance might be interpreted as having a literal meaning, there's a literal meaning expressed by my words, and then there might be the intended meaning that I have by expressing these words, because maybe when I say that aloud and my friend is in the room, we've both assigned a conventional meaning to it to be a code phrase. For example, if I say there's music playing in the background, yes, I might be pointing out the fact that there's both music playing in the background, but it could also mean something between us, like, I'm hungry. Do you want to go out to eat? I mean, if my friend and I sat there and we said, okay, so when we say there's music playing in the background, we intend to mean that one of us intends to mean to say that we're hungry and we're asking if we want to go eat. But I could, in a moment of cleverness with my friend who's in the room with me, I could say, and let's say their background music really is playing and there's music really playing in the background that I have pulled up on YouTube. For example, this Skyrim ambience music, Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim, great game. And I say, there is music playing in the background. That is literally true. Its truth value is true, and it seems easy. I mean, it's beyond needing proof if we're just being pragmatic. If we're just being practical here, us good practically minded people, we don't need to come up with a proof of that. It's easily verifiable with anybody that has a properly working set of ears and all things being equal with their neurology, right, with their brain. But what if I also mean to use it in the intended? What if I also mean to intend it to carry the meaning of the secret code that my friend and I both kind of drew into that phrase as a matter of convention, because we agreed to do that. And now I mean two things at once, and my intended meaning might be both. Or maybe my intended meaning in this case really is just to point out that there's background music, and a slip of a memory, or I didn't really want to say the meaning that we established in code with one another, right? So it would seem that that's the case. That's what's going on with this speech act theory. So a direct speech act would mean that the literal meaning of my words that any common speaker of the language would conventionally take to be the literal meaning of my words are in fact literal, and that was just my intention. My intention wasn't to be poetic and clever and symbolic and witty and anything like that, where I'm trying to suggest a different meaning with my words, right? I feel like that's kind of what we're getting at here. So going back to direct speech, an unmodified utterance as opposed to indirect or direct speech act, it says speech act in which a locutionary act corresponds exactly to an elocutionary act. So it would seem that you can only have an act of direct speech if it carries both this literal force and a possible non-literal force. So there's the force of the intention behind the utterance, and then there really is from the speaker. There's the force of the utterance, the intention that the speaker overlays on these words to communicate to whomever it is. The speaker having an understanding that to whom they're speaking can use that language and is a educated speaker of the language and can understand conventional common sense meaning, right? So there's this possibility for the words to be taken out of context and to be eisegized, if I'm pronouncing that right, where we kind of like implant our own personal views of the meaning of the statement based upon some subjective matters. There's that possibility. So let's see what a constitutive speech act is. That could shine more light on our investigation on our inquiry here. Constitutive Speech Act says an utterance that can be evaluated in terms of its truth conditions. Okay, an utterance that can be evaluated in terms of its truth conditions, and it calls that Constitutive Speech Act. So I guess an utterance that can be evaluated, as it says, in terms of its truth conditions, I guess that would just mean any expression that you have that can be considered to be true or false, and that can be part of an argument, that could be the premise or conclusion of an argument, that could be proved in some sense, that could theoretically be true or false, right? So if we're trying to present the truth and set for the truth, then from the point of view of this theory, I guess we're uttering a lot of constitutive speech acts, but I don't have any reason why you would need to add that descriptive consonant when the meaning is more clear. That just seems to obscure things beyond what is necessary. Obfuscation isn't really ever necessary if you're, or usually not necessary if you're trying to present matters clearly to whomever you're teaching. So you have we can express utterances that theoretically can be true or false. We can express utterances that we intend just for our audience to take very literally, and then we can express utterances that we intend for our audience to take both literally and figuratively or non-literally, or metaphorically, or symbolically, or as referencing more than the literal content, as having more force than just that literal force that gives us a sense of what it's referring to in a particular place, in a particular time, right? We intend it for its meaning to go over and beyond the literal. So there's that possibility too, which seems absolutely obvious. And going back, Speech Act theory is supposed to be a way of looking at language that considers language in terms of its speech acts. And, the thought just came to me, like, doing these YouTube videos, without an audience, it does kind of feel like you're speaking into the void, and that you're not heard, and that no one there is there to have a conversation with you or to care about the things that you have to say. You're just kind of speaking into this nameless, entityless void, just making meaning for nothing to happen or arise out of it. But of course, I know that this keeps me sharp and capable of doing this kind of work with my students, of looking at terms and trying to make sense out of all these ideas, and then really trying to evaluate these ideas. What's the value of knowing anything about Speech Act theory? Could there be implications for creative writing? But do you need to even understand it in the field of creative writing in these terms? Do you need to understand communication in the field of creative writing, or especially fantasy fiction writing? Do you need to have any grip with these terms? Constitutive Speech Act, elocutionary, locutionary, direct, indirect. Is there any point to knowing all this? From the point of view of other fields? Are there any implications that matter at all for students, or for writers, or for speech makers, for storytellers, for logicians, for philosophers? Does it matter at all, is what I'm really saying. And I think that that's a really good kind of mode of inquiry to keep in mind, is to ask that question kind of always. Does it enhance your thinking about things that are important to you in any way whatsoever? And does it add to your learning in a way that is fun and will maybe generate more creativity as you perform the actions that you love doing, like creating content like this, or reading, and so on and so forth. And my answer to this is I don't quite see much value to these ideas so far. I'm incapable of seeing any implications for anything that matters to me on the basis of these ideas, even though I feel like I've pieced together an understanding of them somewhat without reading, without reading the content that they have within the specific chapters of the book in regards to these terms, without going into more detail. I feel like I have like a working understanding of it all, right? Language can be looked at as something we use to perform actions to achieve the ends that we deem to be productive of what we want, or that we deem to be important to what we want from life, or whatever, right? Okay, maybe we could list out the different types of speech acts. I mean, maybe that list is impossible to finish, because the amount of things that you can do with language, the amount of things you can do with language, especially with other people, in whatever specific situation or context, how could you list all those possibilities, right? I mean, there's so many different things you do, and you can make it more and more specific or more broad. But regardless, I mean, I guess it's interesting, but it is very theoretical, I suppose, and is a little bit cut. It is kind of disconnected from practical reality. We don't have to think about things from the point of view of speech act theory to live our lives in a way that pleases us and pleases others, and to live our lives in meaningful ways. We don't need to know any of that. So still wondering about what the value of any of it is. It could be the product of the armchair, sort of armchair theorizing, and I mean, it's creative, I suppose, but so let's look at just one more thing. Let's see about this term called pragmatics, and see if that helps us along the way with understanding any of this, because that's the glossary recommends you to look at that term. Pragmatics. It's the study of how we communicate in language, with emphasis on speech act theory, an approach to discourse analysis. Okay, so speech act theory is obviously a part of the meaning of pragmatics in this textbook. So is discourse analysis. I don't know exactly what discourse analysis is. Maybe I could look that up to see, but pragmatics is the study of how we communicate in language. So if the questions already ever arose to you, man, how do we communicate in words? It seems almost silly, because it's obvious that we do communicate, and we communicate successfully in ways that can be, in ways that in all sorts of ways, I suppose. We've communicated successfully for a long time before we ask any of these theoretical questions of how it actually occurs, right? To become more explicit in our understanding of how successful communication occurs. But then it tells us to go to discourse analysis. So pragmatics, a study of how we communicate in words. Don't really see much of anything in that. Let's see if there actually is a definition for discourse analysis. Okay? It says systematic study of discourse. Okay, don't know what discourse is. Discourse is defined continuous speech, whether spoken or written, larger than a sentence. Discourse, continuous speech, whether spoken or written, larger than a sentence. Okay, so I guess if we take that meaning of discourse, and discourse analysis is just the examination, I suppose, of discourse, which is spoken or continuous spoken or written speech at least larger than a sentence. So if you have two sentences written down on a piece of paper, suddenly that means you have discourse from the point of view of these definitions. We all know what it's like to read a book that has many sentences and paragraphs and chapters, right? So I guess that book is an example of discourse, since it has more than one sentence and it's continuous flow of written words. I mean, what do you do in discourse analysis, though? Let's see. It's a systematic study of that discourse. There might be critical discourse analysis. Let's see if that's a term. Critical discourse analysis is a systematic study of features within a discourse in relation to the socio-political context in which the discourse occurs, also called CDA. And it says, see also stylistics. Oh my gosh. So critical discourse analysis is we're going to study discourse, which from the point of view of these definitions, and we have to remember this is the point of view of the definitions, and this probably isn't the point of view we're used to seeing things from. Study the features of the discourse in relation to the socio-political context in which the discourse occurs. The socio-political context within which the discourse occurs. So if there is a interview on CNN or Fox News between a news anchor and some figure, there's discourse involved there, and it's an interview, and it's a going of back and forth, asking questions, answering questions, presenting challenges, meeting the challenges. So we don't just study, the linguistic features of all of this. If we could write it all down and look at, the style of speaking that the two people have, or what their syntax is, or their diction, or their I don't know, anything at all, their style, I suppose. But we're also going to look at it from the point of view of the socio-political context, which I guess is looking at it in terms of its place within society and with its role within, politics. How is it political? How is it social? What function does all this discourse have for society? What function does all this discourse have for politics? How is it political? How is it social? Is it valuable for our society? Is it detrimental to our society? How has it changed things in our society? How are certain individuals of certain groups within our society invested within these things? What's at stake for certain individuals? How is politics connected to this? What politicians are involved? Whose politics? What political party? So on and so forth. Is there agenda? Is there prejudice? Are there biases? Is there a specific game plan involved? These sorts of questions would be a part of our analysis of a discourse like that. But I mean, if you think of discourse as just anything greater than two sentences, and a toddler wrote, "I am special, period, I love my mom," then how would we do a critical discourse analysis looking at this discourse in light of the socio-political context within which it arises? The toddler was 5 years old when it wrote this down. Let's say it spelled all the words correctly. The handwriting is pretty neat for that toddler. It might show us something about our society that in the politics, that maybe politics have worked hard to create the conditions in which families can raise a child to have this kind of skill at such a young age, and maybe it's an example of a population of other children that are like this too. So the fact that this even occurred does tell us something about society, does tell us something about the politics of that society. So I guess that would be critical discourse analysis, is that we do take it as a sign, or a symptom, or a sign. It could be a symptom of society or the politics of society. It could be a sign of certain features of certain conditions within the society that have been brought about by political actions on the part of our elected officials. I guess there could really be a connection there to even just a discourse as simple as a child writing two sentences on a piece of paper that are interconnected, I guess. And I wonder what a critical discourse analysis would conclude about this, right? I mean, what does this tell us about our society and the politics of our society? And of course, you got to know a little bit about politics to be able to perform a critical discourse analysis well, and you got to know more about our society to perform a critical discourse analysis as well. What brought this into being? What caused this to come to be? What are the conditions of the possibility? What are the conditions of this book's what made this book even possible in the first place? What in society and what in the politics of that society made it possible for this book made it possible for Ann Curzon and Michael Adams to and anyone else who was involved to bring this book into its final state, to create this book, right? And if that is connected to economics, which connected to society, which is connected to politics, which might, connected to our freedoms and to our education, into our rights, into our liberties, into our safety, into our wealth, into our possibilities that stand open before us, then I guess critical discourse analysis would have something to say about all this. But it says, again, systematic study of features within a discourse in relation to the socio-political context in which the discourse occurs, also called CDA. And just to finish this video off with a look at stylistics, since that definition recommends we take a look at that term, it says stylistics is study of language as used in artificial contexts, such as literature, judicial and political speech, etc. Study of language as art or craft. So you could study language. You could study language in its artistic manifestations and its artistic forms, such as the style of a poet or the style of a novelist, or you could let's see what else. You could study it in other artificial contexts, such as jurisprudence or judicial context, looking at laws and law books or political speeches. So you can look at language in different contexts, as this says. You can also study it as an art or as a craft. So you can look at language as something that can be used in the literary arts, or something that can be used that can be crafted and made beautiful. You can look at it as something that can be used by the legal system in the courts of law, or in law schools, or in books of law, or in political philosophy or political science. You could look at language and how it's used in literature of different genres, or the literature that was produced in different movements by different authors and writers. Or you could look at language and how it appears in political speeches, maybe the inauguration speeches of the last 10 presidents. You could compare them and look at the language within there. And when we're looking at style, I don't always necessarily know what features of the language we're actually looking for. We might be looking for word order and syntax and the presence or absence of clauses and phrases of certain kinds. That's fine. That's it seems very quantitative, as if we're just counting these things and noting the order that it all appears. We could maybe list off, different predications or the different terms that are taken as subjects of these sentences. I mean, we could do all this kind of things, but that seems very, very technical, overly technical and specific, and it doesn't really seem to amount to much unless we look at the ideas and get into the humanity of the political speeches, get into the mindset of the time, into the culture, and to compare it and contrast it to other time periods within the country, for example, or just to look at it to see how it moves your heart, right? Or to understand its argument and to be looking for the proof that's offered to support the claims, or to look at what explanations are given or what's alluded to see how it moves the heart and what beauty there might be in it, or what urgency or what emotions, right? that, you know, how can it inspire, right? Those seem to be more important things because it's more important to the human heart than just, you know, studying it in this coolly, you know, I don't know, how would you say it? Like this very formal, this very coolly formal, structural kind of way. That's highly symbolic and logical and you know, like quasi mathematical and systematic and schematic, and there's symbols, and there's diagrams, and there's like all these other markings that kind of make that a little bit more symbolically logical or something like that. All right, I think that's good for this video.